You, Julianne. Well, you're in for a treat today with Nancy Dickson, who is going to be speaking on the power of myth, what it is, and what it does. Nancy and her husband are recent residents to Okamic, and we are really glad to have them. A book of Greek myths got Nancy hooked on myths as a kid, but it wasn't until grad school that she suddenly discovered myth outside the traditional Greek, Egyptian, Norse cluster, and her world exploded when she saw the incredible variety of myths in the world. Nancy has taught at several colleges and universities and lectured for the Smithsonian, Johns Hopkins, and Rhodes Scholars. She was a non-traditional student who didn't graduate from anything until she got a BA after her children were born. She then dashed through an MA in urban planning and returned to the humanities for her PhD in Celtic mythology. Her dissertation is entitled, and I love the title, Armed and Dangerous, the Figure of the Warrior Woman in Early Irish Saga Literature. Growing up in a family that loved to tell stories, some of them even true, moving constantly as a child, an adult, developing a love of languages, a growing an awareness of the power of words to create and destroy, all led to her PhD, as I said, in Celtic mythology. She loves to tell stories to anyone who will listen. And I really was so impressed with the many different things that she's done in her life and continues to do. In no particular order, she has been a union organizer, teacher, grades 4 through 6, college professor, continuing education and ESL, translator, writer, editor, proofreader, art and fashion model, La Leche League leader, office organizer, secretary, political activist, wife and mother. So you're in good hands today with Nancy. So welcome, Nancy.
Good afternoon. It's wonderful to see so many of you here to listen to me talk about myth. Now, I could talk about myth for the next 2 weeks, but I'd get hoarse and you'd get bored and hungry. So I've honed my talk down to 3 points, and I will focus I love technology most of the time. Okay, I don't think you actually need to see this first slide. I'm going to focus specifically on the area surrounding the Mediterranean Sea. Mediterranean means literally the sea in the middle of the earth. This is the fertile ground that gave birth to the myths that we are most familiar with today. Although I've narrowed the geographic focus to a relatively small area, I'll be working with a very big time frame, basically the past 50,000 years. We'll go sliding through most of it. Myths are universal. They exist in every human society and have existed coevally with humans. That is, myths have been around as long as we have. Myths are what makes us human. Each myth system, each belief system, they all explore universal questions. Where did I come from? Where will I go when I die? What is the purpose of life? How should I live? In short, the questions that keep us awake from time to time into the wee small hours of the morning. We want answers, and our fertile brains are happy to supply them. Today, I'll be addressing an additional question. Where did myths come from? Myths did not spring full-blown like Athena from the head of Zeus, but were created by humans for humans. It's caught up with me. There is no myth, no religion out there somewhere waiting to be discovered. Myths are malleable. They're not static, fixed, or immutable, even those that have been written. Each time a myth is shared, the person hearing it may add or subtract a bit, like the medieval scribes who sometimes added commentary that was then copied by future scribes, passing on the first scribe's error. Some of these medieval scribes even went through and systematically scratched out, obliterated the names of women in the manuscripts they were copying and replaced the women's names with the word femina, which simply means woman. Thus, over time, they rewrote Christian documents and history to include only men. And finally, because they are the bedrock of society, myths are powerful and can be manipulated to shape or distort a culture. But all of these are attributes of myth. Trying to define a myth is more challenging, a bit more slippery. The famous myth scholar Joseph Campbell offers a deceptively simple definition. Myths are the stories we tell ourselves to tell us who we are. In the Hopi tradition, the storyteller is a revered and almost mystical figure. In both pre-literate and semi-literate societies, the person who has access to the myths is a powerful, respected figure. And in some myth systems, no one has access to all the stories. Through myth, humans describe or define that which cannot be seen, explain the inexplicable, and put the chaos of the universe into some semblance of an understandable order. At their most basic level, myths comfort us by offering a sense of order and meaning to what is an unpredictable, chaotic world. In spite of all their many differences, one common thread runs through all myth systems, and that is the creation of divine beings. From our earliest days, our world has been a scary, dangerous place. We need someone, something more powerful than we are, someone or something in charge, so we don't have to be. And early humans came to two fundamental realizations: the inevitability of individual death and the endurance of the social order. I will die, but the society will keep on going without me. This epiphany is the cradle out of which all myth is born. Another of Campbell's definitions, myths are someone else's religion. For this talk, I'll use the term myth to refer to all belief systems, possibly even yours. This is not out of any disrespect, but because all humans have some belief system, using one word, myth, for all of them allows us to discuss them without privileging any one or two of them. A third definition before we dive in. People tend to use the words myth and mythology interchangeably, but myth is the story and mythology built like all other ologies, sociology, psychology, biology, is the study of that story, the study of that myth. So let's take a look at this storytelling process, this myth making, the stories we tell ourselves to tell us who we are. As a species, we have an amazing imagination, an ability to answer and ask questions. As far as we know, only humans ask, where did I come from? Where do I go when I die? What is the purpose of life? And my favorite on some occasions, is this all there is? Just as we do today. Our earliest ancestors looked up at the heavens. They saw the sun and the moon come and go. They looked at those around them and saw babies being born, one person suddenly emerging from another person. Where there was one, now there are two. They saw people get old, get sick, suffer, die. They saw plants come up out of the ground. Some were good to eat, and some made people very, very sick. Why? How? Why? Out of the swirling void of the cosmos and the uncertainty of life, they questioned and began to tell stories to answer these questions. Some stories, some myths survived, some did not. But these stories are not straightforward fiction. Our ancestors had to figure out how to express the inexpressible, how to describe that which cannot be seen. If we believe or sense that there is something, some force greater than we are, something powerful that we cannot see, touch, or feel, how do we shape that belief that we have into some communicable form that we can share with others? One way is through myth. Again, the stories we tell ourselves to tell us who we are, what the world is like, and how to live. The remnants of these stories from our earliest ancestors are expressed in 2- and 3-dimensional images because writing hadn't yet been invented. These ancestors of ours had the ability to think and plan for the future and to remember and learn from the past. This sophisticated thinking not only helped them to cooperate in order to survive, but it also opened the door to imaginary realms, spirit worlds, and a host of intellectual and emotional connections that infused their lives and ours with meaning beyond the basic impulse to survive. And because it enabled symbolic thinking, the ability to let one thing stand for another, it allowed people to make a visual representation of things they could imagine and spin stories about. Now, for most of us, I think the word myth conjures images of deities, polished, poised Greek gods and goddesses, colorful Hopi deities, many-armed, graceful Hindu deities. But myth is more multifaceted than just stories of gods and goddesses. While myths tell us about deities and the supernatural, they also tell us how we should live and who we are as a people. Myths are also transmitted through a culture without using words. Think about icons, temples, idols, stained glass windows, hymns, dance, passion plays. All of these tell us a story about belief. Some belief systems recorded their stories and became people of the book. Others, like the Celts, believed that there were things too holy, too important to be transcribed, to being put down on paper where anybody could find them, but they needed to be passed orally from one person to another. Today, I'm going to take you to 3 time periods. Big span of time, but I promised you that in the beginning. The earliest known mythic expression comes from cave art about 50,000 years ago. The next period we're going to look at is called Old Europe, and we're going to finish up looking at the Indo-European invasion. Moving back in time 50,000 years, representations our ancestors left for us in the caves of the Périgord region of southwest France. If you're still traveling and you haven't been to this marvelous part of the world, I recommend it highly. They offer us tantalizing clues about their stories, their myths, and their challenges. These cave paintings give us a glimpse of our ancestors trying to connect with a spiritual or a psychic aspect of their lives. I'll ask you to just close your eyes for a minute and try to imagine what it would take to impel you to enter a dark cave. No flashlight, no cell phone. The dark cave entrance leads to a cave possibly full of dangerous animals, like the cave lion. But our ancestors, using only a sputtering reed torch or small oil lamp, carrying the paints and pigments they'd need, braved the stale, bad air at the back recesses and walked as much as a mile into the cave. They went to paint these amazing, often enigmatic figures. If you still have your eyes closed, I've got a new slide up here for you. And besides, I don't want you to go to sleep. Many of these animals have since gone extinct, but some of them are amazingly modern looking, like these horses. Others, like this head of a cave lion in the upper left corner, is so lifelike he could be ready to spring out and tear you limb from limb. We will see this beast again in just a couple of minutes. Now remember, these paintings that took hours and hours to construct could only be seen by someone else making that long trek to the back of the cave. We can see these as an attempt to commune with the numinous, to invoke spirits of animals, of death, or tell stories about their encounter with death, the death of the animals necessary so that they, the humans, could live, or in some cases, how the animal prevailed and the human died. These huge animals could not have been hunted by an individual. This required a group effort, people working together to ensure their food source. Now, alone among all other animals, only humans know that they are going to die. We're also conscious of the fact that in order for us to live, we often take the life of other living beings. In many cultures, hunters will apologize to the animals they are getting ready to kill, even ask their permission. But the cave was not exclusively paintings of animals in the hunt. In many caves, there are large swaths of handprints. Many of these are female. And up until more recent times, we have continued to use high or difficult to reach areas inside sacred spaces to continue our story of the relationship between human and deity. These distant ancestors of ours also left us sculpture, three-dimensional images that tell part of their story. This one is a human torso crowned with a lion's head and dates to the same era as the cave paintings. The lion man is upright, his ears cocked forward, waiting to hear what we have to say to him. Now, one of our ancestors dedicated more than 370 hours, or about 2 months, to carve this figure. It's carved from hard mammoth tusk, a complex and time-consuming task. Artists engaged in creating something like this, or the cave paintings, were not free to farm or hunt, but had to be supported by the entire group, which shows the importance of this representational work to the community as a whole. While this is our earliest known representation of a hybrid human-animal, instances of this imagining of hybrid creatures appear throughout the world, continuing into modern times in comic books and videos. Probably most familiar to you are the Sphinx from Egypt, the Minotaur from Greece, the elephant-headed Ganesh from India, the hawk-headed Horus from Egypt, and the manticore, a fearsome man-eating beast from Persia. Were the people creating these imagining what our connection to other living things could be? How they might turn into an animal or part of an animal? Were they imagining shape-shifting beings? Were they showing the particular powers of a deity? We still use similes today to express various traits. The strength of a lion, which takes us all the way back to the fearsome cave lion. Leaping forward in time to about 7,000 BCE, we find a civilization that Marita Gimbutas has labeled Old Europe. We have a larger and much more varied archaeological record of the mythic thought from this period. Temples, altars, frescoes, rock carvings, as well as symbols and signs engraved or painted. On all of them, these give us a tantalizing clue as to the rich mythic life of these early people who worshiped a great goddess. The religion of Old Europe was polytheistic and dominated by female deities. Before the first cities of Mesopotamia and Old Egypt were built, Old Europe was among the most sophisticated and technologically advanced places in the world. At its peak, 5,000 to 3,500 BCE, Old Europe was developing many of the political, technological, and ideological signs of what we call civilization. The primary goddess inherited from the Paleolithic was the Great Goddess, whose functions include the gift of life and increase of material goods, but she also brought death. And finally, regeneration. The plant dies, the seed goes into the earth, and finally rises again, reborn in the spring. This is imagery that they would have recognized. The society that evolved in and with this myth system engaged in cooperative work, raising huge dolmens, portal graves, and other works of monumental architecture, all without using mechanical devices. You all may be familiar with Stonehenge or the dolmens of Brittany, awe-inspiring. Resources were made available for these monumental projects and religious practices, in part because they did not engage in warfare. None of their resources went into creating an army and killing off the young. Our vision of the role of this goddess is colored by a label that was given to her by archaeologists and scholars in the last couple of centuries. They called them Venus figures. But Venus, and these are on the left, Venus, as the Romans knew her, was the goddess of love, beauty, desire, sex, fertility. The statues we have of the Greco-Roman Venus were obviously created to satisfy the gaze of men. When scholarly interest in the classical period rose in the West, Venus became one of the most widely referenced deities of the Greco-Roman mythology, and she became the embodiment of love and sexuality. She's usually depicted nude in ancient statues and modern paintings, but her nudity reinforces the stark contrast to the so-called Venus figures on the left of old Europe. These ancient figures, and again, the left-right juxtaposition, were not designed to please men with their beauty, but were intended to direct our attention to the reproductive power of the female. As seen in these three images, she is represented having dominion over animals, whether it be the cats flanking the throne of the goddess on the left, the Minoan figure holding snakes, or Inanna standing with her foot on a lion. Inanna, by the way, was worshipped for longer than Christ has been. Before we leave the folks of old Europe, I'd like to take you to another cave, but this one was constructed by humans, by your ancestors. This underground cave and covering mound was constructed by a farming community on the Boyne Valley in Ireland. Much like a modern-day church or synagogue, Newgrain provided a space for the living community to connect with the world of their deities and to serve as a focal point for ritual, celebration, and burial. The passageway within Newgrange is just less than 60 feet long, about as long as this room, and leads into a chamber with 3 side recesses. This chamber is roofed by a corbelled vault, a technique of spanning an opening by having successive pieces of rock laid on top of each other. They did not use cement to hold these together. This is dry rock construction. This whole thing is covered by a stone cairn which is estimated to weigh 200,000 tons. Not only has it survived, but it has remained watertight without any conservation or repair for 5,000 years. Can you get a roofer today? The cooperation and engineering required to move these huge rocks and assemble them would be phenomenal today, but the people who were doing this work did not have any of the modern technology we rely on. The most spectacular piece of technology at Newgrange is the small opening at the front of the structure, which allows the sun's rays to enter at the winter solstice, marking the beginning of Earth's rebirth, with warming temperatures moving into spring. The shaft of light illuminates the otherwise dark corridor to hit the farthest wall. Built 500 years before the Great Pyramids and more than 1,000 years before Stonehenge, this incredible timepiece still marks the winter solstice, using the sun's rays to mark the beginning of the new year, and could have served as a powerful symbol of the victory of life over death. The miracle of engineering and obvious knowledge of astronomy stands as a monument to these Pacific people, goddess-worshiping, probably pre-literate folks. Now, much as I would love to say that this civilization was brought to an abrupt end through an invasion of Indo-Europeans, because it's just so dramatic, I can't. The truth is much more prosaic. Indo-European speakers coming out of that purple area in the middle began a sweeping migration that continued over a long period of time. Long period of time being not hundreds, but thousands of years. The name Indo-European came into being in the 19th century when Sir William James, an English philologist, was stationed in India and learning Sanskrit, when he noticed that many of the words in Sanskrit bore an uncanny relationship to Latin. He investigated further and found a whole family of languages that stretched across the entirety of Europe and into the Indian subcontinent. These languages span the same area shown in the migration map. The incursion of the powerful warlike Indo-Europeans had a catastrophic effect on the myths and cultures of the huge area they invaded. The familiar myths that we know today are descended from these conquerors. All these myths start with a war or a power struggle. From the Mahabharata in India to the wars among the gods in Norse myth, war, warfare, and veneration of the strong warrior form an intrinsic part of Indo-European myths. This change is shown in the archaeological record. While only 2 to 3% of all figurines recovered from old European sites were male, and grave goods did not include weapons, as the power and influence of the Indo-Europeans arose, we find hill forts and graves that include weapons and sacrifice, both human and animal. Over time, the Indo-Europeans superimposed their patriarchal social structure and male-dominated pantheon of gods on the gynocentric in people of old Europe. Little out of order here. The images across the top are from old Europe. The ones below are from the periods following the Indo-European invasion, which are more familiar to us. In the Greek pantheon, for example, Zeus rules with his thunderbolt, as do Odin with his spear and Thor with his hammer. From the earlier triad of maiden, mother, crone, beliefs and social order were shifted, converted to valorizing that of Father, Son, and Spirit. From the fertile power of the female, the goddess is demoted to human and becomes a vessel to be impregnated, willingly or unwillingly, by a male force or deity. We see the focus shifted from the healing power of the earth, the fecundity of the female, and the cooperation of the group, to veneration of power and control through physical conquest. What an astonishing change. How did and do societies move from one myth system to another? Sometimes it happens slowly through accretion. In Greece, for example, you'll find a Christian church built on top of a pagan temple, which is on top of an earlier pagan site, which sometimes is on top of an even earlier burial site. Or transition can be forced by a more powerful group. We saw that happen in this hemisphere, where the invading Europeans forced conversion on the people already living here. It's much easier to control a group if you prohibit or transform their belief system, because that's what holds their culture together. That's what creates their cohesion. We can see the overlay of the Indo-European invaders' beliefs on myths from Greece, which are well known to all of us. In 8th century BCE, when the Greek writer Hesiod told us the story of Pandora, he told us Greece had a golden age, an all-male society of immortals who were reverent to the gods, worked hard, and ate from abundant groves of food. There was no strife, no suffering, and plenty to eat. But then Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to humans. As a punishment, Zeus created Pandora, fashioned out of the earth, and gave her to men. Each of the gods gave Pandora a gift, according to Hesiod. Hermes, for example, gave her a shameless mind and a deceitful nature, along with lies and crafty words. She was sent to earth to be the wife of Epimetheus, the brother of Prometheus. We all know what happened next. Curious, deceitful Pandora, sent to earth with a jar, told never to open it. When she did, she released all the ills, all the bad things into the world. In some accounts, she slams the lid shut and manages to trap hope in the box. Although Hesiod has left us the earliest recorded account we have, it's not the original story. It's one that dovetails with his patriarchal worldview. Zeus punished the technologically advanced society of men by creating a woman. Woman as punishment. But Pandora's names, somebody's been mucking about with my slides. Pandora's name speaks down to us through the years to tell us that wasn't her original story. In Greek, pan means all or universal. Think panorama, panacea, Pan-Hellenic games, and it's coupled with Dora, a word that means gifts. Originally, rather than unleashing all the ills possible on humankind, her gifts to humans were all the good things of life. But this did not mesh with Indo-European patriarchal ideology. And slowly, over time, her story was changed. But as we have seen, myths are transmitted by more than just the written word. A 5th century amphora it's lost. Sorry. A 5th century amphora in the Ashmolean Museum in England shows Pandora emerging from the ground, her arms upraised in the Epiphany gesture. A winged figure hovers over her with the inscription, quote, Pandora rises from the earth. She is the earth, giver of all gifts. From the same era in his play, The Birds, Aristophanes mentions a cult, quote, to Pandora, the earth, because she bestows all things necessary for life. Two modern scholars have concluded, in the patriarchal mythology of Hesiod, her great figure is strangely changed and diminished. She is no longer earthborn, but the creation of Zeus. Rather than a story that changed over time, the myth scholar Robert Graves calls Hesiod's version, quote, an anti-feminist fable, probably of his own invention. Now, some of you may be thinking of Eve, who, like Pandora, was said to be responsible for bringing evil into the world. The Old Testament of the Bible offers us two creation stories. In the first, God creates man and woman simultaneously from the earth. In the second story, God creates Adam for the earth and Eve later out of Adam's rib. The woman who was created at the same time as Adam was called Lilith. Some myths contend that Lilith was furious with Adam's attempt to dominate her, when, in fact, she had been created equally and simultaneously with him. In frustration and anger, she left Eden, determined to satisfy her grievance. In one myth, Lilith retaliated by disguising herself as a serpent, entering the Garden of Eden and tempting Adam's second wife, Eve, to eat the forbidden fruit. You can see how myths and stories circulate, and each one changes slightly. A third version has God expelling her from the Garden of Eden when she refused to obey Adam. Most of these early stories come from an area that was called the Fertile Crescent when I was growing up, that part of the Near East where agriculture arose. This area was also a fertile ground for myth sharing. So many stories, so many deities, all with common images and threads. Inanna and Lilith have a great deal in common. The story of Inanna was preserved for us by an Akkadian poet and high priestess, Enheduanna. Inanna, the goddess of Uruk, went one day to flirt with the god of wisdom called Enki. They're having a feast, and she encourages him to continue to drink the wonderful wine she's brought. He drinks too much. In his inebriated state, she persuades him to give her all his knowledge. Now, this is the god of wisdom, the god of knowledge. She persuades him to give her all his knowledge and wisdom, which he does, and she takes it to her people of Uruk. These myths offer an answer to questions. Why is there evil in the world? Well, there was a snake. Well, there was a woman. Well, according to the Hopi, evil comes into the world when people are out of harmony with the world. What are the penalties for disobedience to a god? What is the relationship, or what should be the relationship between men and women? These are all tantalizing, familiar streams running through these myths. That sounds like, well, it's almost like, that reminds me of, there are no boundaries to myth. They travel with people as far as people go and are shared broadly. This transmission of myth is like a cosmic game of telephone. Myths circulate, each one affecting the other. For the most part, this is not done intentionally, but because we as a species like to make sense of the world, we try to fit bits of information into what we already know. For example, when Christianity was brought to Ireland, the Irish tried to make it with what they already believed. And I'll be talking a lot more about this during the winter term in my course on Celtic mythology. Because myths are so embedded in a culture, it's difficult to see the far-reaching implications of those myths that inform one's own culture. In our culture, generally, snakes are bad because they brought about the downfall of man. In the Hopi culture, snakes are good because they bring the rain. Virginity is good. Mary was a virgin. But in other cultures, other myth systems in the Middle East, they're tales of the rightful king who must have intercourse with the high priestess of the temple, standing in for the goddess, to assure his connection to the powers of the goddess. Modern scholars added their commentary to this by labeling it sacred prostitution. The Celts have an interesting twist on this. I was going to end this talk by showing how a universal symbol of life and love was perverted for political ends, but I think most of you are already familiar with the way Hitler took the swastika, which had been a worldwide symbol of peace, prosperity, and turned it into a symbol of hatred and dominance. Instead, I'd like to leave you with some questions about how your own mythic background shapes the way you see the world. Two major myth systems have had a profound effect on our society today: the classical Greco-Roman mythology and the Judeo-Christian tradition. How do these myths, these stories, color your mostly unconscious view of the world? What is the influence of the depiction of women in these traditions? Eve, the temptress who defied God and caused us to lose paradise. Pandora, who brought all the ills and woes to humans. Farther afield, we have the sirens whose songs lured sailors to their doom. It's almost impossible for us to get far enough out from our own culture to see the effects myths have on us. According to Harvard professor Maria Tatar, our foundational narratives are used not just to educate, but also to indoctrinate. If you've spent your life in a culture influenced by patriarchal belief systems, do you wonder why people have trouble imagining a woman in power? This is, of course, changing today, and we can see myth-making in action. It's not quick, not without reversals, but the changes seem to be marching us more or less inexorably into a more equitable world. Maybe we're on our way back to old Europe. I'd like to leave you with this thought: the myths and the social structure of the Indo-Europeans has created the world we are living in today.
Nancy, thank you for that insightful presentation. And I want to remind folks that in the fall semester, ILR will be having a series of lectures by folks in the classics department on the Greek myths. And then, as Nancy mentioned, in the winter semester, she'll be doing a series of lectures on Celtic mythology. So if you're intrigued by mythology and mythological issues and questions, join us in the fall and winter semester. So now, Nancy, I know you'll take some questions.
Absolutely.
Do you see a counterpart in sacred prostitution with sacred celibacy?
That's a question that had never occurred to me. I've seldom gotten a question that brought me so completely up short.
Short anyway.
Tell you what, I'm going to get back to you on that because I really don't have an answer. Anything I said would just be blah, blah, blah.
Good question.
Yes. We've got a question over here.
Were you ever lucky enough to meet Joseph Campbell or spend any time with him?
Unfortunately, I was not. I have seen his effect on our culture in Star Wars and in, again, shaping a little bit more of patriarchy, the hero with 1,000 faces, the monomyth that says all myth is the hero's journey. He goes out and he discovers and he comes back. And I'm very excited that I've gotten a book coming in now that is called The Woman of 1,000 Voices. More about that later. Back to Larry's question. One thing about sacred celibacy, it seems to me, is the opposite of male joining with female, but male saying, not going to have anything to do with those dangerous, evil-bringing women. I'm going to hold myself in the old golden age of Greece where there were no women, just men, and life was perfect. Off the top of my head.
Just a comment, not a question. Perhaps the whole business of sacred isolation, which I believe, as far as Christianity is concerned, began in North Africa and then traveled across Europe, and where it became an aspect of Christian worship in certainly up until the 15th century of hermitage. That may be related in some way as well to this question of separating genders. But that practice to me seems more like the choice of solitude. And there may be other cultures, perhaps some in Mesoamerica, that also choose solitude as part of connecting to the all.
Yes, I think that's a very interesting comment. We as a species seem to have two very conflicting needs. We need to have other people, but we also need to have space to be quiet in ourselves, to be still, hear the voice that nobody else can hear.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. I'm looking forward to your ILR course. I just had a quick question. In your flow chart of the languages, where does Arabic come in?
I can go
You
back
had
to
the
it.
Indo-European and the Middle East, the Arabic language. Yeah, that was it.
There it is. Okay, if you start from the far left, that's the farthest east. So Indian, Armenian, Iranian.
Okay, Iranian and Persian. I guess from Persian, Arabic language, I don't know. No? So Arabic is not an Indo-European language?
Apparently,
I don't know.
not according to this chart.
Yeah.
That surprises me.
Okay. But this was a fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Arabic and Hebrew are Semitic languages. They are not related to Indo-European at all.
Do we have one more question? Well, I'm going to end with a question, and that is, you know this Barbie movie that's out? I have not seen it, but I'm really wondering if that's part of the myth-making phenomenon that you're talking about.
Yes, we make myths constantly with our movies, our songs. The songs are the stories that we're telling to tell us who we are. And you look at the difference in the songs from the era when we were children are very different. The stories that were being told then are very different. You know, you wouldn't have an Oklahoma being produced today. We're not telling that story anymore for a variety of reasons. So just be aware as you wander through life of how you're being affected by the stories around you.
Thank you.